Right now, governments are releasing classified files about non-human intelligence and hidden truths, once called conspiracy. But nearly 2,000 years ago, the Nag Hammadi texts described something terrifyingly similar. Invisible rulers, spiritual manipulation, and a hidden version of Jesus erased from history. What they buried in the desert may explain far more than anyone realizes. And the deeper this video goes, the more disturbing the connection becomes. Watch until the end, because the final revelation changes everything.
What if the story of Jesus you were taught was only half the truth? Not completely false, just carefully incomplete. What if there were ancient gospels, hidden for nearly 2,000 years, describing a Jesus radically different from the one most people know today? A Jesus who spoke not about guilt and punishment, but about awakening, inner divinity, and escaping invisible forces controlling humanity itself. What if these texts were once read by early Christians across Egypt and the Middle East, and then deliberately buried to keep them from surviving? Because that's exactly what happened. In 1945, near the cliffs of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a farmer uncovered a sealed jar hidden beneath the desert sand. Inside were 13 ancient codices containing more than 50 forbidden texts, gospels, revelations, and secret teachings that challenged the foundations of Christianity itself. And here's the part that changes everything. The people who decided what would become the Bible already knew these texts existed. They made a choice about what humanity would be allowed to read and what would be erased from history. Today, we're going to uncover what they buried, why they feared it, and why the discovery of Nag Hammadi may completely change the way you see Jesus, Christianity, and reality itself. Once you understand these hidden gospels, you can never unsee them. So let's start at the very beginning, not the beginning of the Bible, but the beginning of a question that has haunted spiritual seekers for 2,000 years. Who was Jesus really? Not the institutional figure, not the political symbol, but the actual teacher, the man who walked around the ancient Near East saying things so radical that multiple governments wanted him dead and multiple religious establishments wanted him erased. Because when you go back and look at the historical record, the picture is far more complex and far more fascinating than what gets preached on Sunday morning. The tradition we're talking about today is called Esoteric Christianity, and it's not a modern invention, it's not a New Age rebranding. It was there from the very beginning. In the first 2 centuries after the death of Jesus, Christianity was not one unified religion. It was an explosion of competing movements, interpretations, and communities, each claiming to carry the authentic teaching of the Master. Some of those communities followed what would become Orthodox doctrine. Others followed something deeper, something more interior, a path that wasn't about institutional membership or ritual performance, but about gnosis. That word comes from the Greek, and it simply means knowledge, but not the kind of knowledge you get from a book or a sermon. Gnosis is direct, experiential knowledge of the divine. It's the difference between reading about fire and actually touching the flame. These communities, these early practitioners of what we can call esoteric Christianity, believed that Jesus came not to found a religion, but to trigger a spiritual awakening in the human soul. They believed he was pointing inward, not upward. They believed the kingdom of God he kept talking about wasn't a place you go after you die. It was a state of consciousness you could access right now, in this body, in this life, if you had the right knowledge and the right understanding of what you truly are. And the texts they used to transmit this teaching are what ended up buried in that jar at Nag Hammadi. Now, the story of how those texts were discovered reads like something out of an Indiana Jones film. In December of 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging near a cliff at a place called Jabal al-Tarif looking for fertilizer. His shovel struck something hard. He dug around it and found a large sealed earthenware jar. He was afraid to open it at first. There were local stories about genies being trapped in sealed vessels. But eventually greed won out over superstition, and when he smashed the jar open, he found not gold, not treasure in any conventional sense, but something far more valuable, papyrus manuscripts wrapped in leather, 13 codices that had been hidden there for roughly 1,600 years, most likely by monks from a nearby monastery who were protecting them from destruction. Because by the 4th century, the newly institutionalized Christian Church, now allied with the Roman Empire under Constantine, had begun actively suppressing alternative texts, alternative interpretations, alternative Christianities. What didn't fit the orthodoxy had to disappear, and what was in those manuscripts? The Nag Hammadi library, as scholars came to call it, contained the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Secret Book of John, the Reality of the Rulers, the Gospel of Truth, and dozens of other texts that painted a portrait of Jesus and of creation that is almost unrecognizable compared to the canonical New Testament. These are the biblical secrets they never told you. Not because they were false, but because they were powerful in the wrong direction. They gave power to the individual, not to the institution. Let's talk about the Gospel of Thomas, because this is where things get immediately fascinating. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't tell a story. There's no birth narrative, no miracle sequences, no passion and resurrection arc. It's simply a list of 114 sayings attributed directly to Jesus, many of them strange, many of them deeply esoteric, and many of them with no parallel anywhere in the canonical Gospels. One of the most striking sayings goes something like this: "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." Read that slowly. That is not a theology of external salvation. That is not a doctrine about believing the right things so that an external authority approves of you. That is a teaching about inner alchemy, about the divine spark that lives inside every human being, waiting to be recognized and brought into the light. That is the Jesus teachings that esoteric Christianity has been trying to transmit for 2,000 years, and that the forbidden gospel tradition preserved when everything else was being burned. And if you resonate with any of this, if something in you is waking up right now, make sure you follow this channel and share this episode with someone who's ready to hear it. There are millions of people walking around with a hunger for exactly this kind of depth, and they just haven't found the right door yet. You might be that door for someone else. Now, to understand why these texts were suppressed, you have to understand the cosmology they described, because it wasn't just spiritually radical, it was politically radical. The centerpiece of Gnostic theology, as found throughout the Nag Hammadi scriptures, is a vision of creation that completely inverts the conventional reading of Genesis. And to understand it, we need to talk about three things: the monad, the Demiurge, and the Archons. In Gnostic cosmology, the ultimate reality is not a personal God who sits on a throne and judges humanity. The ultimate reality is something called the monad, an infinite, ineffable, formless source of pure being and pure light. The monad doesn't create, doesn't demand, doesn't punish, and doesn't have needs. It simply is. It emanates. Think of it like the sun. It doesn't decide to shine. It simply shines, and from that shining, everything flows. From the monad emanates a series of divine qualities, divine beings, divine dimensions of consciousness, called eons. And together these eons form what the Gnostics called the pleroma, the fullness, the totality of divine reality. This is pure, perfect, infinite divine being. The esoteric tradition, including Hermeticism, would later absorb and transmit this concept in different forms, the idea that behind all visible reality is an invisible, unnameable unity from which all things emerge. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Among the eons, there is one called Sophia, which means wisdom. And Sophia, in an act described variously as passion, curiosity, or overreach, attempts to create something on her own without the blessing or participation of the monad. And what she produces is imperfect. What she produces is the Demiurge. And in Gnostic teaching, the Demiurge is the God of the Old Testament. Not the true God. Not the monad. But a lesser, flawed, arrogant entity who looks at the divine light he was born from and doesn't recognize it in his ignorance that he is the highest God. "I am a jealous God," declares the Demiurge, according to the texts, and the Gnostics asked a devastating question in response. Why would a truly supreme, all-knowing, all-loving being need to be jealous? What would it be jealous of? The very existence of jealousy implies insecurity. It implies limitation. It implies that something greater exists. And from the Demiurge, the Archons are born. This is where the biblical secrets they never told you become almost unbearably relevant. The Archons, from the Greek word meaning rulers, are described in texts like the hypostasis of the Archons, found at Nag Hammadi, as a class of cosmic authorities who govern the material world. They are not demons in the conventional horror movie sense. They are more like prison administrators. Efficient, mechanical, cold, not evil through malice, but through fundamental blindness. They cannot perceive spiritual reality because they were created by an entity that itself cannot perceive spiritual reality. They are, in essence, managers of a system designed to keep human consciousness trapped in identification with the material, the physical, the mortal. Now here's the thing about the Archons that connects directly to the Jesus teachings found in esoteric Christianity. The Archons work not through physical force, but through the manipulation of the mind, through fear, through guilt, through the constant reinforcement of a false identity that tells you that you are small, that you are separate, that you are unworthy, that you need an intermediary to access the divine. Sound familiar? The entire spiritual apparatus of institutional religion, the priest who stands between you and God, the doctrine that tells you your nature is fallen and corrupt, the theological framework that makes you permanently dependent on external authority for salvation. Gnostic Christianity identified all of that as the mechanism of the Archons. The cage is built from concepts, and the key is gnosis, direct, unmediated, personal awakening to your own divine nature. This is the territory explored in one of the most extraordinary texts in the Nag Hammadi library, Epistis Sophia. The name means faith wisdom, and the text is a long, elaborate dialogue between the risen Jesus and his disciples, particularly Mary Magdalene, who in this tradition is not a repentant sinner but his closest spiritual partner, the one who understands his teaching more deeply than any of the male apostles. In the Pistis Sophia, Jesus describes in tremendous detail the structure of the cosmic realms, the role of the Archons, the mechanics of how souls become trapped in cycles of incarnation, and crucially, how they can be liberated. And the liberation is never through ritual, never through obedience to an external authority, never through believing the right creed. It is always through recognition, through the soul waking up to what it truly is. This is also where esoteric Christianity and Hermeticism intersect in ways that are historically verifiable and theologically profound. The Hermetic tradition, named after the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus, who represents a synthesis of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, describes a cosmos very similar to the Gnostic one. The soul descends through the planetary spheres, which are governed by archonic forces, accumulating layers of false identity, fear, and limitation with each descent. And the spiritual path is literally the reversal of that descent, a conscious ascent back through those spheres, shedding each false layer until the soul returns to its source in the divine light. Gnosis, in the Hermetic framework, is precisely this recognition, the moment the individual consciousness remembers that it is not a product of matter, but a spark of the monad itself. And this is what Jesus, in the esoteric Christian reading of his teachings, was actually pointing at. When he said the kingdom of God is within you, that's not a metaphor. That's a cosmological statement. The divine light, the fragment of the monad, the pneuma, the spiritual substance, is literally inside you right now, waiting to be recognized. The Archons can only hold you if you believe their story about who you are. The moment you see through it, the moment gnosis strikes, the game changes. This is also why the discovery at Nag Hammadi triggered a spiritual awakening in the academic and spiritual worlds simultaneously. Because these texts weren't written by people on the fringe of early Christianity. They were written by educated, sophisticated, deeply committed Christians who had access to traditions of Jesus' teachings that predated the canonical Gospels, or at least ran parallel to them. Scholars like Elaine Pagels, whose work on the Gnostic Gospels brought this material to mainstream audiences, made clear that the Gnostics were not heretics who corrupted an original pure Christianity. They may well have been preserving a strand of original Christian teaching that was later declared heretical precisely because it was too empowering, too decentralizing, too resistant to institutional control. Think about what happens to a religious institution if the central teaching becomes the divine is already inside you and you can access it directly. The bishops become redundant. The priests become optional. The creeds become irrelevant. The entire edifice of external religious authority loses its grip. And so it was not a theological dispute that destroyed esoteric Christianity. It was a power dispute. When the Emperor Constantine institutionalized Christianity in the 4th century, the version of Christianity that got elevated was the one most compatible with imperial power, hierarchical, obedience-based, with a clear chain of authority from God to emperor to bishop to priest to laypeople. The Gnostics, with their insistence on direct personal gnosis and their deeply suspicious attitude toward earthly rulers, including the Archons, had to go. And so the texts were banned, some were burned, some were buried. And for 16 centuries, the story of esoteric Christianity lived only in the criticisms of its enemies, in the writings of church fathers like Irenaeus of Lyon, who spent hundreds of pages arguing against Gnostic doctrines, ironically preserving them in the process. Until 1945, when a jar in the Egyptian desert cracked open and the buried light came flooding back out. If this episode is opening something in you, and I suspect it is, because you wouldn't be here at this point in the conversation unless something deep in you recognizes the truth in what we're exploring, then I want you to do something right now. Follow this channel. Share this episode. Not because we need the numbers, but because there is someone in your life, right now, who is asking exactly the questions we've been answering today, and they don't know where to look. You putting this in front of them might be the thing that changes the entire trajectory of their spiritual path. The Gnostics believed that gnosis spreads like light in darkness. One recognition illuminates the next. Be that light for someone. Now, what does all of this mean for us today, in the 21st century, sitting here in a world that seems more confused, more controlled, and more spiritually hungry than ever. It means everything. Because the questions the Gnostics were asking are the same questions that drive every genuine spiritual seeker today. Who am I really? What is this world? What is the nature of the force that created it? Is there something beyond it? And how do I get free? The concept of the Archons, in particular, has never been more resonant. You don't have to believe in literal interdimensional beings to recognize the archonic pattern in the world around you. Systems that keep people anxious, distracted, identified with fear and scarcity, dependent on external authorities for meaning and direction, disconnected from their own inner knowing, whatever you want to call the mechanism behind those systems, the Gnostics had a word for it, and they had a remedy: gnosis, awakening, direct encounter with the divine reality that is your own deepest nature. Hermeticism took this same insight and encoded it in the phrase that still echoes through 2,000 years of esoteric tradition: as above, so below, as within, so without. The monad is both the infinite ground of all being and the intimate center of your own consciousness. The pleroma, the fullness, is not somewhere else. It's here, it's now, it's what you are when you stop believing the story the Archons tell about you. This is the radical world-dissolving core of the forbidden gospel tradition, the teaching that was buried precisely because it works. And it is here, resurrected from the desert, available to anyone with the ears to hear it. The Pistis Sophia ends with a promise. Sophia, after a long journey through confusion and suffering and entrapment by the Archons, finally recognizes the light she came from and is restored to her place in the divine realm. And the message is unmistakable. That is the story of every human soul. The descent into matter, the amnesia, the domination by unconscious forces, the slow awakening through suffering and questioning, and the shocking grace of gnosis, and then the return. The remembering. The recognition that the light was never actually lost. It was only covered over. That is what Nag Hammadi gave back to the world. Not a set of new beliefs to replace the old ones, but a transmission, an invitation to stop outsourcing your spiritual authority and start trusting the light that lives inside you. The Jesus teachings preserved in these forbidden gospel texts are not comfortable. They don't tell you that everything will be fine if you just obey. They tell you that you are responsible for your own awakening, that gnosis is available to you right now, that the kingdom of God is within you, and that the only thing standing between you and that recognition is the story you've been told about who you are. The jar has been opened. The manuscripts have been read. The suppressed tradition is back. And the only question that remains is the one the Gospel of Thomas puts at the very center of the spiritual awakening it promises. Will you bring forth what is within you? Because if you actually do, it will save you. And if this conversation has brought forth something in you today, then let's keep going together. Follow this channel. Share this with someone who's ready. Comment below and tell me what landed most deeply for you, what question opened up, because this is just the beginning of the rabbit hole, and we are going all the way down. There is so much more to explore: the secret book of John, the divine feminine in Gnostic theology, the connection between esoteric Christianity and the mystery schools of Egypt and Greece, the living thread of Hermetic Gnosis that runs from Nag Hammadi all the way to the present day. The tradition is alive. And now, so are you.